Hello. It's been a while since I've done a video, so I thought I would do one um, to wrap up our series about white supremacy culture. But before I get into that, I want to tell you about something really exciting. This Friday at 12:30 p.m., I'm going to be doing a masterclass to celebrate 10 years of Brand by Me, my business. Yay! So I'll be covering lessons on building equitable brands that we have collected over the last 10 years, learning from our, mistakes, frankly, and also celebrating the things that we have been building on and that have gone really, really well. So I'm going to bring that together in a masterclass all about how to dismantle systems of oppression through the power of brand. So I will share the link in the post. And if you're interested, you can register up until I think about an hour before, actually. So you've got a bit of time. But I'd love to see you there. Oh, and it's totally free. It's a free masterclass because I wanted to do it to celebrate everything that my business has been and done and delivered over the last 10 years. So that's the first thing. Right. Let's get into the meat of this post, which is all about the last three hallmarks of white supremacy culture: paternalism, power hoarding, and perfectionism. And those are kind of linked. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about them and then maybe we'll talk about how they're linked and how they work against us in this work. So, as a reminder, white supremacy culture is a collection of traits that both show up, and they are negative traits that show up in cultures that have a high, I guess, incidence of white supremacy, but also they are traits that work against embedding this work of anti-racism and anti-oppression. Interestingly, I just said they're negative, but actually there are, as we've gone through this list, you'll see there's a few of them that are sort of negative, but they masquerade as positive, particularly in the workplace. Perfectionism is one of those, so I'll come back and chat about that. But let's talk about paternalism first. So the way I always think about paternalism is like this. Paternalism is where an individual, organization, institution sort of instigates a parent-child relationship between itself and another individual or organization or institution or entity. So it's one thing instigating a parent-child relationship with another thing in a really inappropriate context. And the reason why it's inappropriate is because obviously this isn't actually a parent-child relationship, but it is a parent-child power dynamic. So it's a way of maintaining and enforcing authority over or power over. So quite often you see this. So obviously when we talk about, anti-racism work, you see this showing up wielded by people who are white, racialized as white, or using the power given to them by white supremacy to enforce that dynamic over people who are racialized as anything other than white, black and brown people, indigenous people, and so on. The reason why, obviously paternalism, this idea of this false parent-child dynamic to enforce authority, is a hallmark of white supremacy because obviously it's super useful way of embedding it. It's a super useful way of immediately establishing white dominance by taking on a parent role, so that by default someone else has to take on the the child role. And it's not appropriate because, again, this isn't a parent-child relationship. So that's paternalism. It shows up very commonly in kind of international relations. It shows up in international development. So this idea of the global south versus the global north is paternalism. The global north is designated as the home of innovation, progress, authority, kind of world leadership, and the global south is the place of kind of poverty, needing to be looked after, needing to have decisions made for, needing to have decisions made for people because not equipped to lead type dynamic. And so, yeah, so you can see how that shows up, and you can see how it enforces white supremacy. In the workplace, it shows up between employees, particularly so white employees versus racialized employees. It can show up in line management. So even if somebody technically is more senior than someone else, they will enforce this kind of paternal power dynamic. So that they can become a they can be seen as a parent. I worked in a global organization, and I remember that one of our regional directors did this with her team of country directors that was that sort of, I guess, reported into her. She'd always use a very almost infantilizing way of talking about her team. So she'd be like, oh, they don't know better, or they they don't know any better, or yeah, we need to make sure we look after them because they're just not used to this. That sort of dynamic. And yes, she was a white woman, and a lot of her team were based in various global majority countries. And so that's how she kind of exerted her authority, was by, positioning them as almost like children within the wider organization. So anyway, that's paternalism. And yes, it's a form of white supremacy culture. It's a really useful way of embedding a racist power dynamic whilst seemingly doing something positive. So saying, oh, I want to look after them. Oh, they're just not ready. These sort of caring type language is used to enforce this dynamic. Or, in the international development space or in the international relations space, it's, we want the best for these countries. We want to build peace, so, we are going to be the ones to make decisions, and that we being kind of white dominant environments or cultures. So that's paternalism. The second one we want to talk about then is power hoarding. Power hoarding is where groups or individuals withhold power from a group that really should have that agency and power. So they withhold it for themselves. So it's literally like hoarding, like, holding stuff, you're hoarding power. So you're keeping it for yourself. And it shows up in, obviously, it shows up in organizations, it shows up in dynamics. Where it shows up in racist power dynamics is because it shows up where, global majority folks should, by default or by their circumstances, have agency, power, decision-making, ability to do stuff, but are blocked from having it because a person who's racialized as white and carrying that authority and dominance decides to keep the power for themselves by, for example, changing laws, changing rules, creating new criteria, gatekeeping, so preventing access. These are ways that power is hoarded. Obviously it is a hallmark of white supremacist cultures, because a really useful way of ensuring a racist status quo is making sure that people don't have access to power, decision making, or any agency. And the way to do that, withhold it and keep that power for yourself. Whereas the opposite of that, in environments that are serious about liberation, we talk about power sharing. Power sharing and power redistribution. So we're actually changing those hierarchies away from racist hierarchies to something that is more equitable and allows for, I guess, the status of the global majority to be reasserted. Whereas right now, we're sitting in a white supremacist culture. That's power hoarding. Paternalism, power hoarding. You can see how those two are connected, right? Because obviously, where we are, they're both ways of making sure that the agency, power, decision making, and resources effectively sit with people who are racialized as white. So you can see how those two go hand in hand, because paternalism, this idea of parent-child dynamic, and then as a consequence of that, taking power away and keeping it away from people that should have it, because overtly, and you're explicitly saying, well, maybe positioning them as not being fit for purpose. Racialized folks are not fit for purpose to have this power, but in reality kind of withholding and hoarding it so that it maintains the state quo, because the status quo is working for you if you are a person racialized as white in a white supremacist system, even if that is quite uncomfortable to acknowledge. Where we see power hoarding and paternalism happening, it's because people are using racist power dynamics in order to benefit themselves and keep hold of that power. Does that make sense? Cool. So the last one we're going to talk about is a really big topic. It's perfectionism. And remember when I said this is the one that is a a negative masquerading as a positive, because this idea of perfectionism, I've been watching a lot of MasterChef the Professionals, and I love it at the moment. And they often talk about the dish needing to be perfection. It needs to be perfect. And obviously what they're saying there is we want it to taste good. We want it to, not have visible mistakes. We want it to be cooked properly. And we want it to have be something that's going to be delight people. Now, all those things are really good. But ultimately, perfectionism, this idea of perfection, it's a shorthand for some desirable things we want that food to be. It's not actually literally perfect, because that's not possible. There'll always be a tiny flaw. The good thing about food is food and enjoyment of it is pretty subjective. So, the Marmite effect, people love it, people hate it. So ultimately, there's a limit to that, of course. Things that are not cooked properly and give you food poisoning, obviously ain't no one going to like that. But this idea of perfection in the culinary world is achievable because it's not actually asking something to be perfect. We might be working with ingredients that show up differently. We might be working with something that's cooked differently. This idea of perfection isn't actually perfection, it's just delightful. Whereas when we talk about actual perfectionism, we are talking about the expectation for things to be absolutely perfect. And that, as we know, is totally impossible. So what it does in white supremacist cultures, what perfectionism does, it keeps people working to a standard that can never be achieved. So in an organization that's doing anti-racism or anti-oppression work, it is a form of procrastination. I've seen it often. That teams are delegated the responsibility of delivering kind of an anti-racist action plan or plan of action or program plan. And then the person in charge of running that program or the leadership sponsor keeps going back and asking for changes because they're like, well, it's not perfect. It's not right. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. And all that is, it's just blocking action from happening. So it keeps us in this cycle of ever iterating things without actually getting to a point where we're actually implementing the changes that so need to be seen. So it's this form of organizational procrastination. So that's one way that perfectionism shows up. And a way that it obviously then, if we're talking about anti-racism work, if we're expecting something to be so perfected that we're not actually implementing anything, of course, what happens? The dominant status of racism just continues, doesn't it? So, and therefore it serves the white supremacy culture that's in the organization. Another way that perfectionism shows up in this work is in a standard, an unequal and inequitable standard that is levied at global majority folks. And I've seen this, I've experienced this as a black woman, in a workplace environment where the person is seeking to get ahead. So for me, it showed up when I was looking for, at various points actually in my career, where I've been ready for and demonstrating all of the criteria needed to be promoted. But the feedback leveled at me is, yeah, but when you did that, it wasn't perfect. So, sorry, don't get the promotion. Now, of course, there's no such thing as perfect. And when I'd look over at my white colleagues, they would not be held to the same standards. And the standard of perfection just got ever higher the more that I achieved, to block me from ever achieving that, I guess, that level of leadership. And that's a way that perfectionism was used to embed a racist power dynamic, because obviously I'm a black woman, and to block a black woman from being the first into leadership, as it would have been in any organization I'd been in, I was given this impossible set of standards to achieve under this guise of, it needs to be, it's not perfect yet. So that's another way that perfectionism can really embed a white supremacist culture and continue this status quo of racism. Some other ways that perfectionism shows up, but may and some other outcomes of perfectionism, really. So this impossible standard being levied in order to stop people from doing the work. It leads to a real fear of getting it wrong, because things aren't perfect. There's just fear of getting anything wrong. It leads to perhaps over-consultative. So, of course, don't get me wrong, this work needs to be collective effort, but there's a difference between collective decision-making and endless consultation, which actually isn't then implemented or taken forward. And what you see in perfectionist cultures is the latter. Because again, if we just keep going out and consulting people without actually doing anything with that information, it allows this status quo of racism to persist. So those are the three, I think. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes over there. I guess the final thing to say is that when I'm talking about perfectionism, I'm saying that it's impossible. We need to be clear that there's a really big difference between mistakes and things that are imperfect and harm. So, of course, when we are doing this work of anti-racism and anti-oppression, and we're saying, it's progression over perfection, as my friend Suleiman always says. And Suleiman Arkan, he's on Substack, and I will link to him so you can go and find and read his stuff too. But as he always says, progression over perfection. When we're saying this, we mean that don't let an impossible standard of perfect stop you from making progress in tackling systems of oppression. What we're not saying is allow harmful, deeply flawed systems to persist because nothing can be perfect. See the difference? And what's really interesting is I find that in perfectionist cultures, that perfectionism is never applied to a really harmful, flawed system, practice, or process that needs to be stopped. That perfectionism it's never levied at that system in getting it to a place where actually it stops being harmful. No, it instead uses a blocker for the anti-racism and anti-oppression work in the organization. Anyway, that's my my reflection and my analysis on the last three hallmarks of white supremacy culture. We've talked about paternalism first, we talked about power hoarding, and finally we've just talked about perfectionism. I'd be super interested to hear from you on, which of these resonated, maybe how this is showing up in your work, which ones of these are you seeing? And then, as always, paid Substackers will get a little reflection from me on, this time I think it would be on the whole series. So I'll share that separately in our paid subscriber chat. But for now, as ever, do come to my masterclass on Friday, and thank you for being here. I appreciate you all so much. Take care.